No one expected the day to end like this. It started just like any other day in court. There were reporters, a few fans, and the usual camera flashes. People thought it would be another short appearance, maybe a fine or a warning. After all, Rick Harrison and Chumlee were not just any two people, they were stars. People knew them from TV, from the famous shop in Las Vegas, and from their funny and smart deals on Pawn Stars. But what happened inside that courtroom left everyone silent, shocked, and full of questions that had no answers. Rick Harrison sat with his lawyers, calm on the outside but clearly worried. Chumlee, who always smiled and joked, looked very serious. His face was pale, and he kept looking at the floor. No one knew what the judge was about to say. The charges had been talked about online, but most people believed they were minor. Fans thought maybe the two would just get community service, maybe a fine, and things would go back to normal. But the court had something else in store. When the judge walked in, the room fell completely silent. You could hear every small sound, the moving of papers, a cough, the click of a pen. It felt like the air itself had become heavy. Then the judge began to speak. His voice was slow and clear. At first it seemed like a normal court speech. He talked about responsibility, law, and how no one is above the system. People listened carefully, but they still didn't expect what was coming. Then the words came out. Life imprisonment. That one line changed everything. It hit the room like a storm. Some people gasped. A woman in the back covered her mouth in shock. Even the reporters looked confused, quickly checking their notes to make sure they heard it right. Life? How could it be life? That word is not used lightly. It means years, decades. It means an end to freedom, to normal life, to everything outside those walls. Rick's face didn't move at first. It was as if time had stopped for him. Then slowly, his head dropped. Chumlee looked at his lawyers in disbelief. He whispered something no one could hear. But the real moment that broke everyone's heart was not the judge, not Rick, not even Chumlee. It was Rick Harrison's son. He had been sitting quietly in the front row, watching his father, maybe hoping this was all a bad dream that would soon be over. But when the sentence was spoken, he couldn't hold it in. His hands covered his face. His body shook. Tears fell. Real raw emotion poured out, the kind that doesn't need words. Everyone saw it. Even the judge paused for a second, maybe feeling the weight of what had just happened. That one moment, the sun breaking down, said more than any speech or headline ever could. It wasn't just about a TV star going to prison, it was about a family losing a father, a son losing a hero, a home losing its heart. You could feel the pain in the room. People looked away, not out of rudeness, but because it was too personal, too painful to watch. Outside the court, the news spread fast. Social media exploded. Fans were confused and angry. Some said it had to be a mistake. Others wanted to know the full story. What really happened? What did Rick and Chumlee do to deserve this? The truth wasn't clear yet, and that made everything worse. People don't deal well with silence after big events. They want answers, reasons, something to make it all make sense. But inside that courtroom, nothing made sense. It didn't feel like justice to some. To others it was a sign that fame can't protect you forever. Everyone had a different opinion, but all agreed on one thing. The verdict was shocking. No one, not even the people closest to Rick and Chumlee, thought it would come to this. And what about the future? That's the question that hung in the air, unanswered. What happens now to the pawn shop, the show, the fans, the family? Will Rick ever walk free again? Will Chumlee speak out? And will Rick's son ever forget the moment he saw his father taken away in handcuffs, knowing it could be for life? Sometimes one moment changes everything. One sentence, one decision, one tear. That's what happened on that day in court. It started as just another legal hearing. It ended as one of the most emotional, unexpected, and unforgettable days in the lives of everyone who knew Rick Harrison, not as a TV star, but as a father, a friend, and now a prisoner. And still the biggest question remains: what really happened behind the scenes? The courtroom was filled with people trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't supposed to go this way. Everyone expected a simple outcome, a slap on the wrist, a fine, maybe even probation. After all, these were the faces behind Pawn Stars, the beloved show that had been on TV for years, making millions of people laugh and think. But what they got instead was something they couldn't have imagined in their worst nightmares: a life sentence for Rick Harrison and Chumlee. The moment the judge said those words, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Life imprisonment. The kind of sentence that makes your stomach twist, that makes you think about all the things that can never be the same again. Life isn't just a few years, it's not a few months, it's not a small punishment. It's everything. all at once. The word life in prison means the end of freedom. It means never seeing your family, your friends, or the world the way you used to. At first, many of the people in the courtroom thought they had heard wrong. Surely the judge couldn't have meant life in prison. It was impossible. How could two men who had brought so much entertainment to TV screens, who were loved by millions, be given such a harsh sentence? People didn't know what to think. The room became thick with confusion. Some of Rick and Chumlee's closest friends and family looked at each other, hoping someone could explain what was going on. They couldn't understand how this happened. The two men were stars. They had been on television for years, appearing in front of millions. They had built an empire together, not just through the pawn shop, but through the relationships they had formed on screen with fans around the world. They seemed like friends to everyone who watched, and no one ever expected them to be caught up in something so dark. Outside the courtroom, fans were going wild with questions. The media buzzed with confusion, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Social media exploded with people expressing their shock, disbelief, and anger. How could this be happening to two men who seemed so innocent, so genuine? Everyone wanted to know the details. What had really happened? What was the reason for such a serious sentence? But there was another part to this story. While people were struggling to understand the legal decision, the emotional weight of it all was beginning to sink in. The sentence was not just affecting Rick and Chumlee. It was affecting their families, their fans, their co-workers. It was a ripple effect that reached far beyond the courtroom. Rick's son, who had been sitting in the front row, was visibly shaken. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to process what was happening. This was his father. This wasn't just a headline in the news. This was his world crumbling before him. He had been watching his father and Chumlee in the courtroom for hours, holding on to the hope that the verdict would be different, that maybe there was a mistake. But when the judge announced the life sentence, that hope disappeared. And with it, so did the life he once knew. His father, the man who had been a constant presence in his life, the man who he looked up to, was going to prison for the rest of his life. The pain was evident. His breakdown in the courtroom was something no one who was there would ever forget. It wasn't just the family that was affected. Fans of Pawn Stars were in complete disbelief. For years they had watched Rick and Chumlee interact with customers, crack jokes, and share in the excitement of making deals. The duo had become a part of their lives. People felt like they knew these men, even though they had never met them. And now they were faced with the shocking truth that the faces they had grown to love on TV would no longer be there. As news of the sentencing spread, fans took to social media to voice their opinions. Some were angry, some were confused, some were simply heartbroken. They couldn't understand how their favorite TV stars could go from being celebrated figures to convicted criminals facing life behind bars. It didn't make sense. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened behind the scenes. How could it all go so wrong? As the story spread, more details slowly started to emerge. There were whispers of shady deals, rumors of illegal activities, and whispers of things happening off camera that had never been revealed to the public. But no one really knew the full story. The court didn't release many details, and those who were closest to Rick and Chumlee remained silent. For the time being, everyone was left in the dark. The only thing certain was the sentence, life in prison. The court had made its decision. No one could change it. But people still couldn't understand how this could happen to two men who had given so much to the entertainment world. They had created something special, something that had connected with people on a personal level, and now that was all shattered by a decision that no one saw coming. Life sentences don't just change the lives of the people involved, they change everything. For Rick and Chumlee, it meant losing everything they had built. It meant being taken from their families, their homes, and the world they knew. For their fans, it meant saying goodbye to the people they had watched on TV for so long. The legacy that had been created was suddenly at risk of disappearing. And for those closest to them, it meant dealing with the emotional aftermath. Rick's son would never forget the moment his father was sentenced to life. He would never forget the tears in his eyes, the broken look on his face, and the feeling of loss that seemed to fill the room. The decision had been made. There was no going back. But the questions, the confusion, and the heartbreak would stay with them forever. As time went on, people would try to understand what had happened. Some would defend Rick and Chumlee, believing they had been wrongly accused. Others would say they got what they deserved. But one thing was clear, no one would ever forget that courtroom moment. The moment when the world changed for Rick and Chumlee, and their families forever. What had started as a typical court hearing had ended in a way no one could have predicted. The life sentence shocked everyone, and the world was left to try to piece together the story behind the shocking verdict. But even as the answers slowly began to surface, the real impact of that day, the emotional toll, the loss and the feeling of betrayal, was something that would be felt for years to come. It was the hardest moment of his life. Sitting in that courtroom surrounded by strangers and the cold, hard walls of the legal system, Rick Harrison's son felt his world shatter. One minute, he had been hopeful that the worst of this nightmare would be over. Maybe they would just get a slap on the wrist, maybe a fine. His dad, Rick Harrison, and his longtime friend Chumlee had been famous faces on TV for years, beloved by fans for their fun personalities and their work at the pawn shop. But as the judge delivered the sentence, everything changed. Life in prison. The words echoed in the young man's ears, and everything that had seemed certain before suddenly became a blur. His heart pounded in his chest. He could barely breathe. His eyes started to sting with tears, and the weight of the moment began to crush him. This wasn't just the story of two famous men facing charges. This was his life. This was his father. And now his world was falling apart in front of him. His dad, the man he had looked up to, the man who had been his role model, was about to lose everything. There was a loud, deafening silence in the courtroom as the verdict was delivered. The judge spoke those fateful words, life imprisonment, and the room seemed to freeze. Rick's son could hardly believe it. How could this happen? His father, the person who had taught him so many lessons, the man who had always been there for him, was now being torn away. It didn't make sense. It felt like a bad dream, one that he couldn't wake up from. And yet it was real. As he sat there, the tears started to fall. Slowly at first, then all at once. He couldn't hold them back. The pain, the anger, the disbelief, it was too much for him to keep inside. He felt like he was suffocating. His dad was about to go to prison for the rest of his life, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. He didn't know what to do. What could anyone do in this kind of situation? Around him, people looked away, not wanting to make the moment even harder for him. Some people in the courtroom whispered while others just stared, not knowing how to react. It was an awkward, painful moment. But for Rick's son, it was the worst thing he had ever experienced. His dad wasn't just a TV star to him. He was his father. He was the person who had always been there to guide him, to teach him right from wrong, and to show him the way through life. And now that father was about to be locked away in prison for the rest of his life. As the moments passed, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He could feel their sympathy, but it didn't help. It didn't make it better. Nothing could make it better. His mind was racing, spinning in circles. What had happened to cause this? How could things have gone so wrong? What had his father done that led to this life sentence? There were so many questions but no answers. The only thing that was clear was that everything had changed. Rick's son had always been proud of his father. He had always looked up to him as a man of strength, as a father who had built something incredible, someone who had made it in life. Rick had taught him that no matter what, you should always be strong. Always keep fighting. But now it felt like everything Rick had worked for, everything they had built together, was falling apart. The pawn shop, the TV show, the family, it was all being ripped away in an instant. Outside the courtroom, the world was reacting too. People who had followed Rick and Chumlee for years, who had loved watching them on TV, couldn't understand why this was happening. They too were filled with questions. How could two men who had entertained millions now face such a severe punishment? The media rushed to report the details, trying to uncover the truth behind the charges, behind the court decision. But for Rick's son, the world outside didn't matter right now. The only thing that mattered was the reality of his father's fate. As the courtroom emptied, Rick's son was left alone with his thoughts. He couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. He couldn't stop thinking about the last time he had spoken to his dad, about all the moments they had shared. Those memories felt like they were slipping away, fading in the light of this harsh new reality. How could things change so fast? One minute they were a family, together in the same world, and now they were worlds apart. The drive home was silent. Rick's son didn't know what to say. What could he say? Nothing felt right. Nothing felt real. He thought about calling his friends. But how could he explain what had just happened? How could he tell them that his father, the man who had raised him, the man who had been a role model to so many, was now going to prison? The thought of it made his chest tighten even more. As days passed, the reality of his new life began to sink in. His father would never come home again. He would never be there to offer advice, to guide him through tough decisions, to watch him grow. The life sentence wasn't just a sentence for Rick, it was a sentence for his family. They were all paying the price for whatever happened behind the scenes. And as Rick's son thought more about everything that had led to this point, he realized he would never truly know all the details. The media would dig, the fans would demand answers, but only a few would ever really know what had happened. Rick's son, though, was left with the feeling that the man he thought he knew, the man who had taught him so much, was someone he would never fully understand. There were still so many unanswered questions. Was his dad guilty? What had really happened in the days leading up to this court case? Why didn't anyone see this coming? These questions hung in the air like a fog, making everything feel uncertain. And even as time passed, Rick's son would carry the weight of that moment, the moment when his father's life changed forever, in his heart. In the days that followed, Rick's son learned what it really meant to lose someone. It wasn't just the absence of a person in the house. It was the loss of everything that person represented. It was the dreams and hopes they had shared, the plans for the future that were suddenly ripped apart. His father might still be alive, but he would never be the same man again. And that perhaps was the hardest part of it all. It was a moment no one would ever forget. The courtroom had been filled with the sound of whispers, murmurs, and even some nervous laughter as the judge prepared to announce the final decision. No one truly knew what would happen next. Would Rick Harrison and Chumlee be given a second chance? Would the judge show mercy? Or was this the end of the road for the two men who had made millions of fans laugh for years on their hit TV show? But as the judge spoke the words, the room fell silent, and the weight of the decision hit like a thunderclap. The words life imprisonment echoed in the room, and it was as though time itself slowed down. For a moment no one could move, no one could speak. Even the judge paused, giving the room time to process the unbelievable reality. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another day in court. This was a moment that would change everything. The lives of Rick, Chumlee, and their families were forever altered in that instant. The world was watching, but in that room, it felt as though the world had stopped turning. Among the most emotional reactions in that room was the breakdown of Rick's son. He had been sitting in the front row, trying to keep his composure, trying to stay strong in the face of the unimaginable. But as soon as the judge finished speaking, something inside him broke. The tears started to fall, slowly at first, then more quickly, as he realized that his father, the man he had looked up to for his whole life, would never walk out of that courtroom as a free man again. The son's face crumpled with emotion, and his sobs echoed through the quiet courtroom. It was a heartbreaking sight for everyone there, and it wasn't just his family who felt the pain. Everyone in the room could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about a legal decision anymore. It wasn't about the rules of the court or the laws that had been broken. It was about the human side of things, the people who were being affected by this ruling. Rick's son wasn't just a spectator in this story. He wasn't just another name in the background. He was deeply tied to the outcome, and his emotional reaction showed just how much was at stake. He wasn't just losing a father figure. He was losing his future as he had known it. The courtroom, which had once felt so full of activity and buzz, suddenly became a place of stillness. The tension that had built throughout the trial had reached its breaking point. The judge's words hung in the air, but they didn't offer any comfort. Instead, they left a lingering sadness, a sense of helplessness that seemed to fill the room. Rick's son, still sitting there, couldn't bring himself to look at anyone. His entire world had been turned upside down in a matter of seconds. He wasn't just feeling sorrow, he was feeling an overwhelming sense of loss, and it wasn't just him. Rick's wife, family, and friends were also struggling with the same emotions. They all knew that this wasn't just a bad day. This was the beginning of a new, painful reality. They had known about the legal troubles, they had been waiting for the trial's outcome, but no one had truly expected this. Life imprisonment wasn't just a long sentence, it was the end of everything they had known. The end of a family's dreams. The end of a father's presence. The end of a shared future. What was hardest for Rick's son was that he hadn't been prepared for this level of devastation. He had heard stories of people going to prison, of families torn apart by the consequences of their actions. But he never imagined he would be on the receiving end of it. His father had been a hero to him. Rick had been the one who taught him everything, from how to be strong in tough situations, to how to stay grounded no matter how much success you achieved. And now his father was gone, not physically but in every sense that truly mattered. As the judge called for the court to break, Rick's son could barely move. His mind was racing, his heart was broken. He couldn't process it. How could this happen to someone like his father? How could someone so loving, so devoted to his family, end up with such a heavy sentence? The questions spiraled in his mind. There were so many things left unsaid, so many things left unanswered. But there was no time for answers now. The damage had already been done. When the court session was over, the family was left alone in the hallway. Rick's son was still wiping tears from his eyes, trying to regain some control. He didn't want to let anyone see just how deeply the verdict had affected him. He didn't want to show how broken he truly felt. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't hide the pain. It was all over his face. It was impossible to ignore. The media had been waiting outside, of course, and as the family left the courtroom, reporters swarmed them. Cameras flashed, questions were shouted, and the chaos outside was overwhelming. But none of that mattered. Rick's son wasn't listening. He didn't care about what anyone had to say. The only thing that mattered to him was the image of his father, sitting in that courtroom, being told that he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. The reality of the situation started to settle in. There were no more jokes, no more fun moments, no more heartwarming TV episodes. There was only this new harsh truth that had to be faced. Rick Harrison, the man who had built a family legacy on television, was now a prisoner. And his son was the one left behind to try and pick up the pieces. Later that night, as Rick's son sat alone in his room, he couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. He replayed the courtroom scene over and over in his mind, unable to shake the image of his father's face when the judge had spoken those devastating words. But what haunted him the most was the moment when he had seen his father's eyes, after the sentence was read. There had been no hope there, no strength. Only defeat. It was a look Rick's son would never forget. The emotions that flooded the courtroom on that day were not just about legal consequences. They were about the deep, painful human impact of that decision. The loss, the heartbreak, and the overwhelming feeling of helplessness were felt by everyone, but it was Rick's son who had to carry the weight of it all. And as time went on, he would find himself asking the same question over and over: how could this have happened? Why did it have to happen to his family?
The world felt like it had just come to a stop for Rick's son. Sitting there in the quiet of his room, everything that had seemed so certain before now felt completely uncertain. His father, Rick Harrison, and his longtime friend Chumlee had just been sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom scene played over and over in his head. The judge's words, the tears in his eyes, the confusion and disbelief that hung in the air. But now that the sentence had been handed down, Rick's son was left with the crushing reality of what came next. For a moment it seemed like the world outside was carrying on as usual. The sun still rose, cars still drove down the street, and life seemed to go on for everyone else. But for Rick's son, life had changed forever. The suddenness of the verdict left him with no time to prepare, no way to know what to expect in the days to come. He was still grappling with the fact that his father, the man he had always looked up to, the man who had been the center of his world, was now facing the rest of his life behind bars. What did this mean for the future? How would things be different now? The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no clear answers. His father was gone in a way that was hard to explain, and he couldn't see a way forward. He had spent so many years thinking he knew exactly what would happen in his life. His father was famous, well-respected, and had built an empire. They had money, they had success, and they had each other. But all of that had been torn away in an instant. As the days passed, the weight of the situation only grew heavier. Rick's son found it hard to sleep, his mind constantly racing with thoughts of what his father's life would be like in prison. What kind of future would Rick have now? What kind of future did Rick's son have? Everything they had worked for, everything they had built together, seemed like it was slipping away. The pain wasn't just the loss of his father's freedom. It was the loss of everything they had shared, the family dinners, the conversations, the laughs. Now those moments seemed like distant memories, overshadowed by the new reality. Rick's son also couldn't stop thinking about the questions everyone was asking. Why had this happened? What had gone wrong? Was there something he didn't know about? There were so many rumors swirling around. There were whispers about illegal activities, things that had been kept hidden from the public. But no one knew the full story. And the more he thought about it, the more confusing everything seemed. He had always seen his father as a man of honor, someone who made good decisions and always took care of his family. The thought that his father could be involved in something that led to this kind of punishment was almost too much to bear. And yet, here they were. Rick's son couldn't escape the harsh truth. He had been thrust into a world that wasn't kind, that wasn't fair, and that didn't care about the family or the legacy they had built. People would move on, the media would forget, and life would continue without giving them the respect or understanding they deserved. The public didn't know what it was like to be in his shoes, to feel the loss, to experience the pain. They only saw what was in the headlines, what was being reported on TV. But for Rick's son, this was personal. This was his father, his family, and his future that had been torn apart. As much as he wanted to scream, to shout at the world for making everything so unfair, Rick's son knew that wasn't going to change anything. He couldn't change the verdict. He couldn't change the sentence. He couldn't change what had already happened. All he could do was try to move forward, to try to pick up the pieces and find a way to survive. But how do you move forward when everything you thought you knew about your life has been ripped away? The long road ahead seemed impossible to navigate. How could Rick's son deal with the years of heartbreak, the years of loss? How could he face the world knowing that his father was behind bars? How would he ever heal from this wound, from the pain of seeing his father's life shattered? In the days that followed, Rick's son did what he could to keep things together. He kept his emotions bottled up, not wanting to burden others with his pain. But the truth was, he was lost. He didn't know what to do next. The world around him felt like it was closing in. Everyone had their opinions. Everyone had their questions. The media were relentless, asking for interviews, trying to get the inside scoop on what had happened. But none of that mattered. None of that would bring his father back. None of that would fix the emptiness he felt inside. There were times when Rick's son would sit alone, staring out of the window, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. It felt like it had all happened so fast. One moment they were filming TV shows, making deals, and living life. The next moment, everything came crashing down. The truth was hard to accept. Life was no longer the same. And the worst part was that Rick's son didn't know how to face the future. He didn't know what to do now that his father, the man who had always been the steady presence in his life, was gone from it in the most permanent way. Every visit to the prison, every phone call, every letter, it was all a reminder of what had happened. It was a reminder that Rick's son was living in a new world. A world where his father would never be free again. The weight of that was unbearable. How do you move on from something so heartbreaking, so painful? How do you continue when the person who shaped your life is now confined to a cell, never able to live the life they once had? But even as the pain seemed unbearable, there was a small glimmer of hope. Rick's son knew that, no matter what had happened, he still had his memories. He still had the lessons his father had taught him. And even though things would never be the same, maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to honor his father's legacy. Maybe he could carry on the things that Rick had started, and maybe one day he would find a way to make peace with the past. The road ahead was long, and the challenges seemed insurmountable. But Rick's son knew one thing for sure. He would never forget his father. He would never forget the man who had been his hero. And though the future seemed uncertain, he wasn't going to let the story of his father end here. There would be pain, there would be loss, but there was also the possibility of healing, of finding a way forward, even in the most difficult of times. The road ahead was unknown, but Rick's son had no choice but to take the first step. The news about Rick and Chumlee's life sentences spread like wildfire, and the effects were felt far beyond the courtroom. It wasn't just the families who were left to pick up the pieces. The ripples of this decision reached out to friends, colleagues, fans, and even people who had never met Rick or Chumlee. It seemed like the world had suddenly shifted. People began asking questions, trying to make sense of what had happened, and wondering what the future would look like for everyone involved. For Rick's son, the ripple effect was something he could feel every day. He had always lived a life where things seemed stable, where his family had money, fame, and success. They had a TV show that millions of people watched, and they were part of a larger story that had become an American favorite. But now everything had changed. The phone calls from reporters, the emails from strangers, and the social media messages had all become a constant presence in his life. His every move was being watched. Every word he spoke was being analyzed. It wasn't just the loss of his father's freedom, it was the loss of his privacy and the overwhelming weight of public attention. Rick's son couldn't go anywhere without someone mentioning his father's name. The world had become obsessed with the story. People wanted to know how it all happened, what had gone wrong, and what the consequences would be. It felt like a never-ending cycle of questions and rumors. It was as though Rick's son had suddenly become the face of a family tragedy, and everyone wanted to know how it would end. But how could he answer those questions? How could he explain the pain, the confusion, the shock? The truth was, he didn't have the answers. He didn't know how to move forward, and he certainly didn't know how to explain the situation to anyone else. At the same time, people who had once admired Rick and Chumlee were now left grappling with their own feelings. Fans who had spent years watching the two men on TV now had to come to terms with the reality that the men they had looked up to were facing a harsh fate. It was a strange feeling for these fans, many of whom had grown to love Rick and Chumlee for their humor, wit, and the sense of family they had shared on TV. But now those same fans were forced to confront the fact that the world they had watched on screen was not as perfect as it seemed. There was no way to separate the men they had seen on TV from the legal situation that had unfolded. For some fans, the shock was overwhelming. They couldn't believe that people they had admired could be involved in something so serious. How could the charming, larger-than-life personalities they had seen on TV end up in prison? The questions flooded their minds, and many of them were left feeling betrayed. It wasn't just about the criminal case, it was about their own relationship with the show, with the people they had come to think of as friends, even though they had never met. The trust they had in the story they had been told was shattered. It was a hard pill to swallow, and for many it felt like a personal loss. On the other hand, there were others who took a different approach. Some people saw this as a cautionary tale, a reminder that fame and fortune don't guarantee happiness or immunity from the consequences of one's actions. The story of Rick and Chumlee's downfall became a lesson for those who had followed their rise to fame. It wasn't just a story about crime or punishment, it was a story about the complexity of human lives, the mistakes we all make, and the consequences of those mistakes. Some people felt sympathy for the two men, understanding that everyone is capable of making mistakes, even those who seem untouchable. But even in the midst of this, there was a lingering question. What would happen next? The ripple effect was far from over. The fallout from this case was something that would continue to affect everyone connected to Rick and Chumlee for years to come. There was no way to predict how this would all play out. Would their sentences be appealed? Would there be a chance for redemption? Would the public's opinion of them ever change? For Rick's son, the ripple effect meant more than just dealing with the press. It meant dealing with his own feelings of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. He had always believed that his father was a good man, someone who made wise choices and worked hard for everything he had. But now everything seemed clouded in doubt. How could he continue to admire someone who was now behind bars? Was his father still the man he had once thought he was? Or had he been living in a world of illusions all along? The more he thought about it, the more complicated everything became. There were no easy answers. There were no clear paths forward. But the ripple effect wasn't just about the negative consequences. It was also about the impact on those who had supported Rick and Chumlee throughout the years. Friends and family, some of whom had known the two men for decades, now found themselves caught in the crossfire. How did you continue to support someone who had been sentenced to life in prison? How did you deal with the public fallout while still trying to hold on to the memories of the good times, the fun times, and the moments that made you believe in them? It was a delicate balancing act, one that no one seemed to have the answers to. As the weeks and months passed, the ripple effect continued to spread. The story of Rick and Chumlee's conviction remained a hot topic in the media. People were still talking about it, still debating what had happened and why it had happened. Some people believed that the legal system had been too harsh, while others felt that the punishment was deserved. In the middle of it all, Rick's son found himself stuck in the middle, caught between the love he still felt for his father and the reality of what had happened. In some ways, the ripple effect was a constant reminder of the loss that had been felt. It wasn't just about the past, it was about the future. What would life look like now? How would they all move forward, knowing that the past could never be undone? The truth was that no one could change the outcome of the trial. No one could undo the damage that had been done. All they could do was try to make sense of the situation, to try to find a way to move forward even though the road ahead seemed unclear. But the ripple effect wasn't just negative. In time there was a chance for healing. There was a chance to rebuild.